Hello, folks. This week you've been reading Chapter 7, which covers the period of time between the Civil War and the beginning of the 1900s. This was a period of time that was, well, at least at the very beginning, was marked with some very serious social welfare needs, and on a national level, a great debate about how to reintegrate the southern states into the Union following the Civil War. And suffice it to say that there was a variety of different opinions about which was the best way to go about that. Nonetheless, the South did wind up back into the Union and as fully functioning members of the United States. But during the course of that time, of course, we know that the individuals that perhaps were most affected, at least prior to the Civil War, by the differences of opinions in the North and the South were the slaves, and that the freed blacks oftentimes had times that were as in some ways as difficult as before the war, if not even worse in some respects. By the end of this period of time, the nation had become a nation that was on the world scene, and it was a player in the world stage. And we had a president who was very interested in engaging us in acquiring lands across the Pacific Ocean and the Philippines and things like that during the administration of William McKinley. And around the period of time when this century, the 1800s, was ending, we were engaged in the Spanish-American War. So this period of time is something that saw great wealth accumulating in the nation, and at the same time saw an increasing separation between the rich and the poor. Because of these changes and because of the overwhelming nature of many of the needs that the Civil War brought upon the nation, the very nature of social welfare itself began to change. Social and economic problems following the Civil War really kind of pushed the provision of social welfare from the private sector, in some areas even as far as the federal government, but certainly beyond the local government and to the state level as well. There were three primary social welfare movements during the late 1800s that are worthy of note. Those are the charity organization societies, referred to as the COSs, the settlement house movement, and the child saving movement. We'll be talking a little bit about each of these in the next few slides, and then we'll be circling around back primarily to focus on the charity organization societies and the settlement house movement. Phyllis Day talks about the social work profession throughout her textbook, and in our lectures we'll also kind of trace that from time to time. And the COSs and the settlement house movements really are the basis for the development of two different types of social work that really still exist today. And so we'll be just keep that in mind as we go forward with these slides. The child saving movement, it was a separate area of interest and had a lot of people very concerned and very involved, but really was something that kind of focused upon a very specific population, children, and their special needs. First, we'll start with the charity organization societies. If you remember from last week, we talked about the associations for the improvement of the conditions of the poor, the AICPs. And the COSs really kind of developed out of the AICPs of the early 1800s. The charity organization societies were formed intending to coordinate all the various different private philanthropic efforts that were going on out there. There were a lot of them, and there was a lot of duplication of services in some respects, and perhaps other populations where services might have been needed but weren't really being provided. And so the COSs were intended to eliminate the duplication and perhaps help direct those services to individuals that were deserving and needy. At the same time, the philanthropic organizations also was dealing with a certain amount of corruption, which seems to be the human condition, I think, and the COSs were intended to deal with that corruption as well and to try to eliminate those things through oversight. The COSs employed the friendly visitors just like the AICPs did as well, and so when they intervened with families or in situations of need, the primary mode of intervention continued to be casework. That was a focus upon changing the individual to deal with the problem of poverty or whatever it is that it might be addressing. The COSs, I believe, primarily focused upon poverty programs. Another movement in social welfare in the 1800s, and really this was much more active in Europe and came to us rather late in this time period, later in the 1800s, was the settlement house movement. Jane Addams, who you have probably heard about, or possibly have heard about, the social work profession really kind of calls her one of the first social workers. Jane Addams was a wealthy young woman who was sent overseas, I believe, for study at the time that she had finished high school, or perhaps she was in university training. And really, only wealthy women would go to university in those days, and usually that was not for really learning a field so that they could work independently, but was really more intended to refine them and to make them better partners for men. In a sense, they were there kind of prepping for their role as the spouse of a powerful man, perhaps, but not really to advance their own education. But Jane Addams, who spent time in England during her education, ran across Settlement House, was there. And the Settlement House was a building, a home where relatively wealthy people would move in among the poor people, and then would work with those individuals in that community to try to help in terms of education and organization, and getting together recreational activities and things like this to really help pull the people together. And so this was really this is what the settlement house was all about, was really to kind of reach out and to help people by moving to where they were and helping them there. And so when Jane Addams came back to the United States, she brought this notion of the settlement house across the ocean, and the first settlement house, called Hull House, was established in Chicago. If you go to Chicago and you go up, I don't think it's called the Sears Tower anymore, but the tallest building in Chicago, at least, was called the Sears Tower. And when you're up there in the observation platform, nearly 100 stories above the city, and you're looking at the little maps of what is below, these little dots and things that are below you, on one of those maps you'll find Hull House. It is really in the shadow of the Sears Tower, and really remained an active program even until early 2012, when the news the news came to us that the Hull House programs were closing because of funding issues and things like that. And so you're really talking about a program there that started in the late 1800s and lasted 120, 130 years before it finally lost funding. So something, I guess, that really took hold in that area. And so there were other settlement houses in the United States, but Hull House is the one that's probably the most famous. And so their focus was really to raise the standards of living for the individuals in the neighborhoods where they were located through education, recreation, and organization. But instead of focusing on individual change and assuming that the person was the problem, the perspective of the settlement house folks was that it really was a societal issue. It was institutions of our society, whether they were too complicated for individuals to negotiate, or whether they were used to keep people in their place, or they didn't provide the services they needed to provide. The assumption of the settlement house workers were that the individuals that they were working with were healthy, and that it was society that needed fixed. And so the method of intervention, instead of being individually focused, was really a group focus, and the focus of that intervention was upon social action and reform of institutions, not on changing individuals. So quite a difference there between the settlement house movement and the charity organization societies. The child saving movement was the third social welfare movement of this 50-year period of time. And as I mentioned earlier, this child saving movement really developed to deal with the very special needs that children presented. It's an interesting kind of a sociological fact, I suppose, that in medieval times and even times since then, even around the times of the settlement of this nation, children in many respects were still looked upon as young adults, little adults. And the fact that they had special developmental needs that needed to be approached differently was not something that really was recognized by a lot of people. Children were put out to work in the fields with the family and things very, very quickly. And I think the notion of play among little children, in these period of times was something that just probably wasn't as prominent as it is today, if it existed at all. But by this period of time, as we began to understand and study human nature a little bit better, people began to recognize that children had different needs and needed to be treated differently than adults. And so the child saving movement partly springs from that, where they wanted to deal with needy children differently than just any other individual in the population. And some of the primary methods that were used during this period of time involved a process called farming out, which is where children were sent out west to, and these were children who were taken from families because of the parents were paupers, and or the kids were running the streets looking for food or something like that, and so those children were picked up and eventually sent to the west to work with families on farms out there to help them get established. The settlers in the west needed extra hands, and so it sort of was felt to be, at least by the people at the time, was felt to be a win-win situation. Certainly not very friendly to families, I would say. But it was felt that the children learned good trades and were given a better life, and that the farmers in the West benefited as well. Apprenticeships, which we've mentioned in previous chapters, were also used, and so children were taught trades and taken again from their own families and living with individuals who had a trade to teach, and provided some cheap labor or free labor in addition. Ultimately, this change in philosophy and the recognition that there was the need to treat children differently and separately resulted in the development of a juvenile justice system and a child protection system that took care of them. And we'll be talking more about that in weeks ahead. And so, comparing the two, again, remember the child saving movement being sort of a different sort of a movement, and in that it focused on just that one population. But if you look at the other two movements, you begin to see the development of two different branches of social work, and you see that at the bottom of each list I have them named. One I call, and these are my labels, professional social work, and the other social action social work. Professional social work is the social work that I think when most people talk about social workers, this is who they're talking about. And they have their origins in the AICPs, like the Charity Organization Society, and the COSs use the casework model. That is sort of the medical model, where you assume that somebody is deficient or ill or sick or needy, and the helper is the person who provides that healing or that education or the help that is necessary, so that you have a sort of a doctor-patient kind of relationship there. That's why it's called the medical model. And that medical model really depends upon the philosophy that something is wrong with the individual, and so the focus then is upon individual change. And as I mentioned today, this really underlies, although hopefully we're much more advanced and refined than this, but this really does underlie current methods in a lot of the social work profession. Much of what we do is focused on casework or therapy, working with the individual. Now, we do things a little more, I'd say a lot more advanced than that, but in any event, this is sort of the root of what professional social work is all about these days. The settlement house movement's origins, as I mentioned, came from Europe and focused upon group work, assuming that clientele were healthy and functioning well, and really focused upon changing society, advocating for change on behalf of clients instead of trying to change the client. And this underlies social work methods that focus upon changing society today. And these are things that we'll be talking about as the semester goes along, but there are jobs one can get in the field of social work and human services that really engages an individual in trying to push the institutions of society along, not necessarily to change the person that is their client. One thing that would become readily apparent to you as you go out looking for work is that the money is not in social action in the field. If you want to make a nice living, your focus is going to be more on the professional side. So we will be looking at these two branches. This is sort of called the two branches of the social work profession. These are the early stages of this, and from time to time we'll return to these two branches. And so this is a slide that's probably worth maybe printing or keeping or making notes about. During this period of time, just to give you a little bit of historical and sociological flavor for this period, the economy was expanding quite a bit during from the beginning to the end. The gross national product, I think they call it the gross domestic product today, but in those days it was the GNP. The gross national product increased by 250% from the beginning to the end of this, so there was dramatic growth in the nation. Per capita income increased, and we were encouraging immigration to the United States. The illustration on the page is, if you don't recognize this, it is the arm of the Statue of Liberty, and you can kind of see how it looks. I think this is actually a photograph and not a drawing, an old photograph. France, if you remember, France sent us the Statue of Liberty as a gift for our centennial in 1876, and the arm with the torch, I guess, was the first piece that arrived, and it was put on display at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. And if there's anything that signifies the importance of immigration to our nation, I would suppose it would be the Statue of Liberty. So not only were there immigrants beginning to arrive in increasing numbers during this part of our history, but also migration to the West continued as well. While the gross national product increased by 250%, we also had an economic depression during this period of time, and at least during two different periods, severe unemployment. And as I mentioned earlier, there was an increase in the distance, or the polarization of the economic classes, the distance between them, the rich becoming fabulously wealthy and the poor becoming just destitute. And while the per capita income increased, the income was clearly not distributed equally, so it became evident that not everybody was sharing in the wealth of the nation during this period of time. Immigration was encouraged, but once the war was over, and the people who had been fighting in the war perhaps needed to be back in the work, or in the job market, then the immigrants were seen as a threat to the labor force, and were not welcomed all that well. This nation has a history of encouraging immigration and welcoming foreigners when we need them for economic purposes, when they serve our purpose. But at times when the economy shrinks, we become quite unfriendly to individuals who immigrate to our nation. And our current present day debate over immigration and how well we should secure our borders is a good demonstration of that. Now we'll talk a little bit about, well, actually most of the rest of the presentation is going to focus upon the different groups. I mentioned last week that Phyllis Day addresses the social welfare needs and programs for each group as she walks through history. And last week I believe we talked a little bit about African Americans and veterans, and perhaps a little bit about women. So we're going to expand on that and add a few other groups this week to this focus. So first, starting with soldiers and veterans, this population was recognized as deserving of aid and was added to the worthy poor, but before any other population did. And the worthy, I should say, the worthy poor. Yes, those individuals who needed assistance. This was the first population where federal legislation was created to address those needs, and that's significant if you remember from last week when we talked about Dorothea Dix, campaigning with the 10 Million Acre Act in Congress, passing the 10 Million Acre Act, trying to engage the federal government in provision of services for the mentally ill and the blind and hearing impaired, I believe, and it was still vetoed by the president at the time. Well, after the Civil War, again, the nation recognized that there was a debt owed to the men who survived, and so the federal government passed legislation to aid those veterans. However, it was the Union soldiers that were seen as the worthy individuals. Southern soldiers were really not provided for with federal programs, and they were left to be cared for by the individual states or by private charities. And this is a fact, actually, I pulled this from, I think it was Ken Burns's series on the Civil War, which is an excellent show if you're interested in history at all. And he pointed out in one of those episodes that in the year after the Civil War ended, 20% of the entire budget of the state of Mississippi, of the entire state, was spent on purchasing artificial limbs for its veterans. The need was just terrible. We move on to looking at the situation for African Americans during this period of time. Throughout the South, after the Civil War, black codes were passed by the various states that continued to place limits upon them, limiting their ability to own property and banning work in certain areas of employment, certain types of areas and things like this. If you remember, we talked last week about how education was also restricted for blacks, and so again you can kind of see the basis for a history of discrimination against African Americans in terms of education and employment that has continued through the modern day, and is again sort of the historical roots of the need for affirmative action programs. During this period of time, the federal government really recognized the black codes were being passed, but sort of was trying to appease the southern states, trying to bring them back into the Union again, I guess, and kind of ignored that was going on. One of the things that would happen in the South is the poor blacks who didn't have a place to stay and no way to take care of themselves would be put into chain gangs and at times contracted out to employers. And sometimes those employers were people who had been former owners and things of the blacks. So black children as well could be apprenticed out to some of their former owners and things like that. And so there were a lot of aspects of slavery that continued, even though technically speaking, legally speaking, all blacks were now free. The Ku Klux Klan began to emerge and strengthen as the Civil War ended. And in fact, one of the generals of the Confederate Army, and his name is escaping me right now, but was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan, in fact. So the KKK began to strengthen during this period. Voting rights of blacks were undermined or denied in many southern states, and this, of course, denies them access to the opportunity to have a voice in their own government, which is a part of what it means to be a citizen in the United States. And so, once again, there were, although technically free and although technically given the right to vote, lots of things were done in the South to prevent black men from voting. Now, mind you, now women did not vote yet. But black men should have been able to. There were different ideas about what to do about the problems regarding race relations after the war, and even Abraham Lincoln, who actually, if you read up on Lincoln, his understanding of African Americans really was evolving at the time that he was killed. And as a young man, I think, I don't know that he was necessarily in support of slavery, but his notions about black people's proper place were really not exactly what you would think today. He really did see them as inferior. He was not in favor of the mixing of the races, say socially or in marriage and things like that. And he believed that in order to really resolve the problems that were going to develop because of free blacks in our nation, that they should be deported to Central America. And at that time, I think we had a notion that Central America was going to become a part of the United States as well. And so remember, Seward bought Alaska not long after the Lincoln died, and so we were really looking to expand. I think there was a sense that Canada would become a part of our nation as well, and so he wasn't necessarily looking to expel them from the country, but he was looking to give them their own spot, their own part of the nation. And segregation as well was something proposed by some black intellects as well, like Booker T. Washington during this period of time. Overall, this population experienced an increase in starvation and disease as they moved from slavery into a wage earning situation. The federal government established a program as the Civil War was ending called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was intended to deal with the problems that transited and homeless blacks faced in the South. Some call it, I think Phyllis Day refers to it as the first federal welfare agency, but nonetheless, it really only provided a certain amount of help, and there were a lot of people in the South who really believed that just back to those philosophies that we were talking about last week, that believed that it fostered idleness and pauperism. Moving on to labor. During this period of time, unions, which, if you remember, were also found their early stages in the last segment of history that we had studied, unions were getting organized again after the Civil War. The war and the expansion west really took the focus away from issues about labor as more people moved away, and I think there was probably some hope during this period of time that the westward expansion would resolve a lot of the economic issues in the East. But nonetheless, that wasn't necessarily the case, and workers, the common everyday workers, began to recognize that they weren't sharing in the profits that were accumulating to the very wealthy. And also, because of the fact that they could, industry began to manipulate labor and requiring long work hours, and looking for favors from women. If the employers would, to keep them employed, because women really weren't supposed to be employed anyway. And so their intent, really, the industry's intent, was to keep a low wage workforce readily available to keep their costs down. And so something was needed to kind of balance out the power that employers had during that period of time. So unions helped in that regard. The problems of poor workers and those out of work intensified throughout this, and pauperism remained the focus of philanthropy, but it wasn't to help people, but it was really to get rid of poverty. Not really even to get rid of poverty so much, it was to get rid of the poor. And the immigrants that were coming over during this period of time just compounded the problems of poverty, and that's one of the reasons why I think our nation became unfriendly to immigrants as well during this period of time. Science also became very popular during the 1800s, and attempts were made to apply scientific methods to study and understand the problem of poverty. And so the COSs, the charity organization societies, began to gather statistics while they were out there doing their casework. And the intent was to try to find, try to identify the most effective way of intervening with poor people, how the kinds of problems that they had, and what needed to be done to change them and fix them so that they wouldn't be needy anymore. And you'll recall the value of social Darwinism, one of Phyllis Day's 9 social values in the first chapter. Social Darwinism emerged during this period of time. That's the survival of the fittest, if you recall, and this social Darwinistic theory implies that the poor were economic misfits who weakened the economy, and so there was a philosophy that said that we should do nothing to help the poor people. Certainly, the government shouldn't. That the wealthy were more morally superior, could give more to society, and those were the individuals that should get the focus of society's resources. So the poor were left, in large respects, the unemployed at least, were left to themselves, to their own. And there was, if you remember back in the European times, we referred to the vagabonds. And this period of time, they were called tramps. And these were unemployed men who were really jumping in boxcars as the westward expansion continued with the railroad, and traveling from point to point looking for work. But there was a lot of mistrust and suspicion about those tramps, particularly because, remember, a lot of them, we had immigrants coming in, and so immigrants looking for work and moving about the country trying to find a place where they could get employed. And there was a sense that they might be labor agitators, preaching revolution. Socialism was becoming more and more popular in Europe, and there was a kind of a fear that these individuals were here to kind of foment change that no one else wanted. And so they were very mistrusted and seen as being very lazy. Families were really the focus, I guess, of the interventions of the friendly visitors with COSs, and when at least when they needed help. And as I mentioned, they were trying to use scientific methods to investigate poverty, but the focus, to remediate poverty, to investigate it as well, I suppose, what the causes were. But really, the COS's efforts were to focus on remediating the individual as the cause of poverty, using the different scientific methods that were coming up. The idea was scientific charity was the thought of the day, not almsgiving, the Puritan almsgiving, so that if help was to be provided, it would be provided to a population that was identified as likely to benefit from it, and the type of help that was provided to the population would be specific to the beliefs about those particular individuals. So that's called scientific charity. Therapy, individual casework, social work emerge to help the poor kind of find their salvation through hard work and clean living. And really, that is still the answer today that we think, at least for people who are poor, is getting a job and living a more moral life and not engaging in substance abuse, which we think they all do. And we all think that they waste their money and have babies so they can get more money. I mean, we don't all think that, but there's a large population of people out there who think that, and this was still there 150 years ago. People were thinking along those lines as well. In fact, the COS leaders really wanted to abolish outdoor relief altogether. That is, to get rid of cash assistance and to provide only kind of casework and change, and counseling for change, workhouses, almshouses, things like that for the poor. If there were elderly in the family, families were expected to take care of the elderly. The only place that really dealt with the problems of the elderly were called poorhouses. And in fact, just reflecting a little bit, my mother and father, they were born in the early 1900s, and I can remember my mother talking about, that we were going to drive them to the poorhouse, and this is the kind of an expression or a term that clearly came from her own mother, so it's just interesting to see this in the text. Little waif down in the corner, if you ever watch Little House on the Prairie, that's little Albert, and he's there for a reason. I'll talk about that in a minute. But children often were removed from the home through this child saving organizations and things, because it was believed that if an individual were to have children, they needed to be of good character, and if they were poor, then they were not of good character. Remember, that was immoral living. So children were removed from families and saving them from a life of pauperism, according to the thinking of the day, at least. There were some agencies advocating for the use of foster homes and group care later in this period of time, but the government really began to develop a focus upon providing cash and direct assistance, because the government decided that it was better for the families to stay intact. So we begin to see sort of a split here where charitable organizations are more focused upon casework and government more upon providing assistance that families needed to stay together. But for those, when children were separated from their families, remember I talked about the farming out. Children were sent to farms in the West, because the fact that it was recognized that children being in almshouses were subjected to the poor influences of those ne'er-do-wells who couldn't take care of themselves to begin with. If you remember little Albert, he came into the Ingalls family when the Ingalls family was visiting in Minnesota for a while, or I think they moved to the city for a period of time, if you remember, in Minneapolis, and he was one of the street urchins running around, and Mr. Pa Ingalls and Ma Ingalls picked him up and took him to the farm, and he lived happily ever after out there, or at least for a few seasons. So, he was farmed out. Phyllis Day's particular area of interest, of course, in women, and she spends quite a bit of time talking about the plight of women during this period of time. For instance, that the vote was extended to black men, but still reserved for males. Neither white nor black women were able to vote. technology was improving, and so women weren't necessarily as tied to that kind of home drudgery that they had been earlier in the century. There were a couple of movements going on at the time that might attract women's interest, including the suffrage movement and the temperance movement. Now, the thinking of the day is that temperance was an appropriate movement for women to get involved in because the impact of the alcoholism that they were trying to eradicate affected the family because of the fact that the guys wouldn't show up for work, and so they'd lose their job, or they'd beat their wives when they were drinking. They were very poor providers, and so women were considered to be proper in advocating for the elimination of alcohol and engaging in the temperance movement. But if a woman was engaged in a movement to get the right to vote, they were kind of seen as being, as having masculinity complexes and really kind of being outside their area, and so their femininity was really questioned quite a bit because the intent was to keep them very dependent upon men. There was a philosophy known as the cult of true womanhood from this late 1800s, which really kind of saw women as a creature that was more spiritually evolved, who had less sexual desire and experienced more feelings of compassion and morality and nurturance than men did. And this kind of arises out of Sigmund Freud's theories, which were becoming very popular in this era. Like as I mentioned, competitive women, those in the suffrage movement, or those wanting to work with men and things like that, take jobs, men's jobs and things, were seen as having a masculinity complex. And as far as sexuality is concerned, if upper class women were getting pregnant, it was only because they were doing their duty and tending to their man, basically, and his desires, and not because they had any sexual desires themselves. But lower class women were believed to be passionate and very sexual, and thus very immoral. More about this later, but it was an interesting kind of a thing here because women were supposed to not be sexual creatures according to this philosophy. If you look at their manner of dress in those days, this is where they wore those corsets, and so their waistline was extremely thin, and they had the big hoops, I guess, for dresses and things like that. Lots of frilly things and that type of thing. And so I think the idea was to hide any kind of idea of sexuality at all in the women. And there was when you read about the late 1800s, you hear about women having these well, they call them the vapors. They kind of have these sort of attacks where they would pass out, and they couldn't deal with stress very well and things like this. And some thinking is that really the method of dress was the thing that was really kind of cutting off circulation to them and in their bodies, literally, and that might have been one of the reasons why that happened. It really wasn't that women were as weak and as dainty as individuals wanted to believe in those days. But for those women who were out of control, or so to speak, or who were getting out of line, they called hysterical. Surgeries were used, hysterectomies. That's where this term comes from, and temperamentalism. We remove women's reproductive organs, and it would help them calm down. And the gynecology really develops around this period of time, and of course, mostly men. The profession in the late 1800s is, again, as I mentioned, the COSs were focused upon casework and moral advice, not outdoor relief. And the assumption here with the charity organization societies was the individual was not functioning adequately, even though their own research was going to show eventually that poverty's cause was more societal and institutional. And their research is the thing that kind of developed, eventually developed this focus that the social work profession has now on a person in situation, we call the ecological model. Some of you in human services and social work classes may have heard this already, but we'll be talking more about that later in the semester. So you have the COS movement focusing on casework. The settlement house movement emerges later in the century among immigrant families, and these workers move to the cities to educate and socialize and advocate for social reform. had the assumption that their clients were healthy and adequately functioning, that the institutions of society were the things that were causing the problems for individuals. And so its focus, instead of casework, was upon neighborhood clubs, social research, and social action. Public and private welfare became increasingly separated. As I mentioned, the government begins to focus more upon direct assistance, outdoor relief, whereas the charitable interventions of casework focuses more upon indoor relief and institutional care. But social work as a profession begins to achieve an identity late in the century, and some years into the next period of time, the first social work text, Social Diagnosis, was written by a woman by the name of Mary Richmond. And social work education develops into those two tracks that we talked about last week, that casework track through the Charity Organization Society that uses the medical model, and the social action track, or the settlement house movement, which uses group work and focuses more upon social change. But one thing is for sure, that by this period of time, social workers just aren't friendly visitors anymore. They're not volunteers necessarily. It's becoming a profession. Now, this period that we're reading immediately precedes the time period in the jungle, and so as you read this book, or as you've been going through this chapter, perhaps if you've already read the jungle, you'll see a lot of the themes that are in the jungle kind of reflected in this particular period of time, even though the jungle happens in the first part of the 1900s, and this is certainly setting the stage for the story of Jurgis and his family. The wealth of the nation increased dramatically during this period, but so did the divide between the rich and the poor. And with industry not regulated by government during this period of time, employers were allowed to do all sorts of things to manipulate and take advantage of their workers. And the wealth just began to become incredible among those who own the industries and things like this. And at the same time, virtually no social welfare programs, at least from the government, existed at that time. And so, again, this kind of sets the stage for the story that you read about Jurgis and his family in the jungle. And because of the great needs that were existing at the end of the 1800s, a new era of reform established in the early 1900s, known as the Progressive Era. And we'll be reading about that in the next week. So with that, we conclude this week's lecture, and hope that this was something that was useful to you. And if you have any questions, I hope you'll let me know. You can reach me by email, call me if you need to, or drop me a line in Blackboard. Thanks, everybody, and have a good week. And please be reading The Jungle. It's very important for you to be in the process of that right now. Thanks very much, and bye-bye.